I understand your question as the ultimate challenge of, well, like if it grows in the garden, is it going to grow in the forest? And your experiment is the garden, and you're trying to figure out if it's going to grow everywhere else. I think in a lot of cases where something looked really good in the short term, and then you rolled it out and it didn't look as good in the long term, or not what you would have expected. I think it's a combination of there was heterogeneity that you just didn't really account for. It might have just worked at that time and place because that place is just straight up different, or that time was a great time to run that intervention for some reason that you have to go figure out, or because you change the equilibrium dynamics of the marketplace. And as a result, there was this temporary bump that kind of evened out in the long term. I think it kind of speaks to the general challenge of experimentation, which is that, like any estimate, your average treatment effect is just a picture of a moment in time and place. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to hold in another moment of time and in another place. Randomization, if it's done well, should attenuate a lot of that. But you also have this problem again where, because the experiment is done over time and you're collecting exposures or individuals, to say in an A/B test, from one day to the next, and experiments don't perfectly overlap. You launch your experiment in week 1, and then in like week 2, somebody else launches their experiment. And that experiment's like really great and is borrowing a lot of your exposures. Then the week 2 exposures are more likely to maybe have a positive impact as it appears in your experiment results, because they're actually bringing in information from the other experiment.
What has been the most surprising fact about the market that you learned about working with experiments, synthetic experiments, and so on?
I'll try to answer the question in steps.
Hey, Causal Bandits. Welcome to the second season of the Causal Bandits podcast, the best podcast on causality and AI on the internet.
As a kid, he hated math, but during his studies, he took an econ class and fell in love with marketplaces. A former soccer player, he combined his love for sports and data analysis, working as a senior data scientist at the NBA. At Lyft, he designed experiments and researched how to make them more efficient. Economist and data scientist at Zoox. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Lawrence de Geest.
Let me pass it to your host, Alex Molak.
Welcome to the podcast, Lawrence. Great to have you. Great to have you in the podcast. And I wanted to start our conversation today with a topic that I think is very interesting to many people who have some background in randomized control trials, and they go to work in industry. They start working in industry, and they encounter a situation where an intervention might affect the market dynamics, the market they intervene on, right? The environment they intervene on. The dynamics can be affected by the intervention. And so when we are in a scenario like this, it might be the case that we might be violating one of the assumptions, the underlying assumptions of randomized control trials or A/B tests. And you worked at Lyft, which is one of the companies that are operating in this marketplace economies. Can you tell us a little bit about your experiences with testing ideas, validating ideas, using experimentation and other tools from causal inference?
Yeah, what makes marketplaces so interesting is also what makes them so frustrating, because you're always hitting a moving target to some degree. So yeah, I worked at Lyft. I loved working at Lyft. It was a really cool company, and it's a really cool product. And like many tech firms, experimentation is the gold standard. And like many other marketplace tech firms, the biggest problem in experimentation is the so-called network effect, or the interference problem, or by some other name, the violation of SUTVA. And the problem that we would have at Lyft, like in many other places, is that when you try to kind of poke one side of the marketplace, you end up affecting the other side. So the canonical example is a price change. If you decrease prices to, say, half the riders in San Francisco, the other half do not face a price decrease, say like a change in the surging or primetime algorithm, then the treated riders are going to be more likely to convert. They're more likely to request a ride because they face a lower price. And the control drivers are now even less likely than they were to convert, because of the interference problem. At any moment in time, the stock of riders is competing for the scarce stock of drivers available at that time. So they're competing for this scarce resource. There's only so many drivers from the hours of like 10 to noon, for instance. And the problem is that every time an individual withdraws a unit from the supply pool, they hail a ride, they take a driver away from dispatch, that means that there's one less driver available to be dispatched to somebody else. So if the treated side is converting more, they're withdrawing faster from the resource, leaving fewer drivers available to dispatch to control, who now face, say, worse, as we say, service levels, so higher ETAs and so on. And they will convert less than they would have. So this is the canonical problem where you measure a treatment effect and, oh, it looks really good because the gap between treated and control is here, but the counterfactual is violated because control might have converted here had the treatment never happened. And so there's a couple interesting things from this anecdote, and this is not original. This has been said many, many times by people way smarter than me. The first is that the degree of the interference that you can expect to see is going to be a function of the elasticity of the supply curve. So imagine a world in which every time you hailed a car on Lyft, you withdraw a unit from the supply pool, but you snap your fingers and another one magically appears. So in other words, every time you take a unit out, a unit magically reappears to take its place. And in that case, you have this infinite supply. And so there will be no interference because there's nothing to interfere with. So in markets that are going to be more oversupply, that have a lot more slack on the supply side, we should see a lot less interference. In markets that have very little slack on the supply side, they tend to be just in balance with the demand, then we should expect to see quite a bit of interference. And these kinds of basic insights have guided how we think about experimentation, about where you experiment, about the nature of the experiment, the intervention that you're going to run, and then the design of the experiment that you're going to run. So walking through all of those, if you think you're going to have a very high interference type of intervention, you might think about strategically investigating it in regions that might have higher supply, and so therefore might have less interference, all else equal. And then the second is that if you still expect to see quite a bit of interference, then the A/B test, while the gold standard, is no longer really going to serve you because you're not going to measure the complete impact of the intervention. You'll measure what we call the direct effect, but not this indirect effect where you indirectly impacted the control side through your intervention. And so in this case, Lyft, like other places, has done a great job at advancing other types of experimental designs like the switchback or the time split, as we call it, where you randomize over units of time throughout, say, a 2-week period rather than randomizing over individuals. And in general, you can even randomize at a higher unit, like you can randomize all of a marketplace, say San Francisco, everyone gets the treatment, the price decrease, and then compare San Francisco using a synthetic control style estimator to other regions out there, in which case you will completely capture both the direct and the indirect effect. But as like in any kind of experimental design, you're making this trade-off between bias and variance. You're going to get a much less biased estimate the coarser you randomize, but then you're going to get a noisier estimate. So part of the challenge of experimentation is trying to figure out, when do we really need a very precise estimate? When do we need at the risk of having a little bit more variance, when do we need a really clean, clear estimate at the risk of having a little bit of noise? And then given that you have a portfolio of interventions that you want to test, how do you dispatch them in the optimal way, given the scarce resources that you have, not just scientists and engineers and other folks who can run the experiments, but just the available stock of marketplaces, riders and drivers that are available to you over which to randomize. Folks at Lyft, like of other places, have also tried to figure out ways to say, given a design like an RCT or an A/B test, how can we, that we know suffers from interference, how can we try to remove some of that interference, sweep it out of the data altogether so that we can still exploit some of the advantages of the RCT? There's this guy at Lyft named Ido Bright who, with a few other co-authors, came up with this technique called MMV, Marketplace Mediated Values, in which they basically solved the dispatch problem at intervals. So they solved this linear program that describes how we dispatch cars to riders based on their marginal value. And using that, they wrote a whole paper that shows that you can sweep out some of the bias to some degree. So a lot of different solutions have been presented, and a major part of the work is finding a creative way to marshal all of these different types of solutions to try to answer the question that you need to answer at any moment in time.
Among our audience, we have many people who will also use methods like synthetic controls, people in marketing, for instance, and in other areas. What are some of the main challenges that you encountered in situations where you decided to use synthetic controls rather than experiments?
Well, we've actually used synthetic controls as experiments. So for instance, we decide we're going to launch some product in a particular set of regions. By launching it in, say, 5% of regions and leaving the other 95% untouched, we've effectively run an experiment. And we can go into later about whether or not you've actually chosen those 5 at random or have not chosen those 5 at random. But there are many cases where you simply can't run an experiment. You have to, say, keep up with the competitor, or there's some kind of constraint that prevents you from running an experiment. And so you launch the product and you want to see how well it does. We've used synthetic control estimators quite a bit in the past. They're an interesting beast. It's a really cool class of estimators that on paper, you think they're going to work super well. And in a lot of cases, they kind of work well and they kind of don't. And you really find out you have to fiddle the knobs quite a bit to get a good fitting model, matches your intuitive priors about the problem. Like, it makes sense that these controls were selected by the algorithm, whichever synthetic control you're using, to match the treated unit or treated units, whichever they are. And getting all of that right is something of an art in my experience. There's many, many different estimators. There's a whole taxonomy of them. And oftentimes you have to explore different ones to see which ones work best. And they don't always work consistently from one situation to the next. So be happy to keep talking about that.
Are there any particular challenges that you encountered in your work with synthetic controls and you were able to encounter in some maybe creative ways?
Yeah, I can think of a few. So like I said, the literature is huge. I think, like, if you dip your hand into Google Scholar and you pull it out, every 3 months, you're going to get a new synthetic controls paper. So there's lots of cool estimators out there, and they're all trying to find different ways to solve the basic synthetic control problem. You know, I got to take a bunch of donors and I got to make them look like the treated unit as closely as I can. And ideally, I want to do it with the least amount of bias and variance possible. So there's a lot of canonical best practices with the synthetic control. Like, since it's based on the theory of factor models, you need a longer time series to make sure that you don't get a biased estimate. There's been a lot of work that's been done in improving inference around synthetic controls. So, the canonical example is the smoking paper from a body over at MIT, where they introduced the placebo test, where you kind of just randomizing which state got the cigarette tax, and then you're using that to estimate the counterfactual, the distribution around the counterfactual. And if you look at their paper, it was an interesting application. The placebo test makes a lot of intuitive sense. You're basically just creating a null distribution, but then you can see in the paper, and I think that they're straightforward about this, they remove certain placebo tests, certain fits from the placebo distribution because they were just too noisy or they just didn't make any sense. And ideally, you'd like to not be in a position where you have to run inference and then kind of pick through it and ask whether or not you want to keep certain placebos. So one of the challenges that we faced was finding really good ways to get consistent, tight inference that we could believe around a synthetic control. And I mentioned the Google Scholar thing because when I was working a lot on these, I started reading papers and just trying to get caught up. And I found this one paper called Forward Difference in Differences, which is by a marketing professor over at UT Austin, Kathy Lee. Really cool paper and a really cool scholar. She's written a ton about synthetic controls, has a lot of great stuff out there. This paper, I think, came out of Management Science in like 2024. And I was really interested in it because it was so simple. It was just deliciously straightforward. It said, you know what, instead of doing the synthetic control problem where you're going to solve a convex optimization and assign some weight between 0 and 1 to all the different donors, we're just going to say, you know what, we're going to use a really simple algorithm to figure out which units, when averaged together naively, so like instead of 3 states getting weights between 0 and 1, each of them just gets 1 over n. So if you pick 3 states, then each one is weighted 1 over 3. And there is no other parameter to fit except an intercept, because then we're going to run a diff and diff essentially on it. And as a result, it's an extremely fast algorithm. So we found it works extremely fast when we coded it up. And she did a lot of heavy lifting to show that there is, under certain assumptions, which are pretty reasonable, that you get a closed form estimate of the standard error. And so as a result, you don't have to appeal to a resampling process. You get a much tighter fit, you get a much faster fit, and you tend to get much smaller confidence intervals without a huge loss in the false positive rate. This actually came out because a colleague and a friend of mine, Amber Wang, over at Lyft, was interested in running this really complex experiment that necessitated a, as we call it, a region split. So randomizing over entire marketplaces. And we had built a power tool for our internal synthetic controls library that tries to say, okay, given that you have like 100 regions or marketplaces that you could treat, which ones should you treat and which ones should you control? This is a super fascinating problem because it's a huge combinatorial space. You have this like landscape. And on this landscape, there are peaks and there are troughs. And the peaks are the best designs, the ones that give you the smallest estimate, the highest powered estimate for the least amount of variance. And then the troughs are like the worst designs. And you're kind of searching over this landscape. And the sheer combinatorics are massive. So like, I think we had this one calculation in this paper we wrote, which I'm getting to, that said like if you had like 100 regions and you wanted to treat 50, I'm forgetting the exact numbers off my head, and it took you a second or it took you a minute to test out every possible design, then the runtime of this power search would be longer than the known age of the universe, which was a fun calculation to make, but not a fun calculation to think about, because you obviously don't have that kind of time. And so you need this clever way to search that space. And we have found that with our initial power tools, where we used classic combinatorial optimization solutions like simulated annealing and genetic algorithms, they try to search this entire space in an efficient way. So they don't actually search the whole thing. They kind of just try to chart the right course through it. They tended to be really unstable. So like you would design an experiment and you're going to launch it in 2 weeks. And then, maybe something happens. You had selected a region, and then someone from another part of the organization says, actually, we're using this region to launch some other product. So you can't use that region anymore in your experiment. So you rerun the power tool, and then you get a whole different design. So that makes it really, really hard to trust the results, and it makes it really hard to plan around your experiment, because you plan and then stuff happens and you have to adjust. I think the really cool thing about working at Lyft, and probably working at a lot of other places, is that you get to design the experiment on which the synthetic control estimator is deployed. And we had this brainwave where we're using this new estimator, forward difference in differences, and it has this algorithm called forward selection. And forward selection had been in the literature before, and the paper was essentially an application of this algorithm to find which control unit should be used as the counterfactual of the treated unit. And we said, oh, well, what if we just flipped this on its head? What if we took this algorithm and then we first deployed it to find which units to treat. And then we deployed it a second time to figure out, given the treated units, which units should be then used as controls. And the idea is that if you have like 100 units, you want to figure out not just which ones to treat, but which ones to control, because then you have a much smaller set of regions that you have to think about and worry about. Because obviously your synthetic control is going to be violated if like you run your experiment and then something major happens in one of the regions, and then it no longer serves as a good, say, counterfactual or contributor to the counterfactual. And so this was a really cool problem. And I think, when you go back and you read these papers, or when I was like looking at synthetic control in grad school, the intervention was always taken as given, which makes sense because as an academic, you're not in the firm, you're not making decisions, you're not able to randomize at will. You think about like a policy happening, like the cigarette tax in the Abadi paper. Well, it just happened. And California got it and a bunch of other states didn't. And you want to try to find a reasonable estimate of the treatment effect of that tax. And so the whole literature really is built around, okay, an intervention happened, how do you estimate the impact of it? But what was, again, so cool about working at Lyft, and I imagine in lots of other places, is that you can go behind the curtain and you can say, okay, well, what if we get to choose the intervention? Where do we intervene? When do we intervene, and how do we intervene? And given that we want to intervene, what's the best mixture of our available resources to treat and control and measure the intervention at least cost?
So I understand what you were doing was trying to find a set of markets or sub-markets that would give you optimal properties for your estimator when you measure them with this particular estimator. So in a sense, you reversed the traditional problem, right? Instead of accepting that the nature has done something and now we are interested in estimating the outcome of this, we are searching what we could do and where in order to use this estimator and get the optimal or close to optimal statistical properties. Is my understanding correct?
No, you're totally right. You hit the nail on the head. The quasi-experimental literature, at least in economics as I've read it, tends to think about nature as the randomizer. This flood just happened and this side of the river flooded more and it flooded these houses and the other side of the river didn't. And, after we kind of net out why people live on one side of the river or the next, we can try to estimate the impact on like property prices or something. But at the firm, we are nature. We are the randomizer. And it opens up this really cool new space to work in. And it was just a pleasure to work with Amber and work with a lot of other people on this problem.
So that's very interesting. I think next week from today, so not necessarily next week from the time our listeners will be listening to this, David Rode from Criteo will have a contribution to our Causal Python weekly newsletter where he writes about confounding and situations where we manage the treatment. That when we actively manage the treatment, confounding is, he says, never the problem. But then he says, next week I will write more about this, and maybe this never is not really never. What are your thoughts on that?
So I guess when he says confounding is never a problem because we manage the treatment, is he saying because we can randomize, and if we randomize well, we don't have to worry about confounding?
Well, we not always are able to fully randomize, right?
Yeah, okay. So I agree with the statement that if your randomization is perfect and everything went just so, then confounding on average is going to kind of sweep out and you don't have to worry about it as much. But nothing ever goes according to plan. And randomization is also a victim of that. So yeah, I'm trying to think of examples where, randomization just didn't work. Like for instance, like at a lot of tech firms, you don't necessarily get to choose your sample size before you run the experiment. You choose the duration. So for instance, like in a rideshare app, you don't know how many people are going to come into the app tomorrow. So let's suppose that you're going to do some experiment, and setting aside conservative interference, you're going to randomize over riders on the demand side. and you realize that you want to detect like a 1% impact. And it tells you that you have to, we had some great power tooling at Lyft, some really awesome tech. And it tells you got to run this experiment for 8 weeks. What does that mean? It means that, well, we don't know how many riders are going to come in tomorrow. We don't know how many are going to come in today. But over a fairly long period of time, we should expect to see this many people. Now, let's suppose that on, week 1, you get an influx of people, say because there's an event, the NFL is happening now, so a lot of people are taking Lyft to the game, or there's some inclement weather or some other thing that nature decided, the real nature, not the Lyft, the nature designer. And it generated, as we say, a lot of exposures. So riders who were treated that might actually be very different from riders who were not treated. We have tools that you can use to try to net out that balance. But in that case, randomization alone was not necessarily going to remove all possible confounding. And so a major challenge there is the fact that you can't ex ante just say, I'm going to randomize over like 1 million people and then just do it right then and there. When you randomize over 1 million people, it happens over a period of time. And over that period of time, you may or may not end up drawing samples that are systematically different from each other in a ways that randomization alone couldn't save you. I agree with the premise. That like randomization alone is a great friend, but it shouldn't be your only friend.
That's very well said. It reminds me of the casino example from Elias Barenboim's paper on confounding in bandits, where he shows that experimental data, if we only look at randomized experimental data, we might not necessarily get to optimal policy. And if we add observational data to this as well, then we can get closer to the optimal policy than only looking at the interventions. I think that's an interesting, you brought us into an interesting alley where we can think about this different scenarios or different contexts where randomization might not be sufficient to answer necessarily all of the questions that we might be interested in. I think one thing that is often neglected when we talk about randomization and causal inference is that randomization gives us identification, assuming that the underlying data generating process is stable and stationary, right? So this is referring to what you said, the example you gave us in a second ago.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that necessarily randomization allows us to answer all causal questions that we might have, right? So for instance, if we go to, in the Perlian lingo, to rank 3 of the ladder of causation, and we want to, for instance, build something as like a digital twin, right? A true digital twin, then only experiments that are interventional are not sufficient to give us the specification of the model that would be needed to build this digital twin. And I think, interestingly, these methods like synthetic controls are sometimes we can use them in a way that gives us maybe a glimpse to this rank 3, right? The counterfactual rank, that we go beyond the interventional rank. But one of the challenges that I often think about when I think about synthetic controls, or when I work with my clients, for instance, and we're talking about this method, is that often we will also meet, on top of this, all the statistical inferential challenges, we will also meet challenges related to identification, right? Causal identification. One of my favorite papers that combines the econometric literature with the Perlian ways of thinking comes from Spotify.
Okay.
And we have a paper co-authored by Kieran Gilligan-Lee, who was our guest as well, I think last year, where they combine synthetic controls with a sensitivity analysis model or layer and partial identification that comes from, let's say, the graphical world. What has been your approach to making sure that causal identification is not violated when you work with synthetic controls. That you don't have some confounding going on there that impacts your decision and the outcome as well.
I think you just got to pick up a shovel and start digging. And what I mean by that is, if you say, I found like a 10% change in some marketplace using my synthetic control, then you have to get into the nitty gritty of that marketplace at that moment in time and try to figure out, was there anything else happening right before or just after? Was there a launch of a new product? Was there like a launch of a new policy? Was there some kind of completely external event like weather or whatever that you couldn't foresee? That 10%, it's not a number you can take home to your mom. It's the number that kind of gives you a suggestion of what could be going on.
Mm-hmm.
When I say digging, I mean that I don't think that there's some kind of like single estimator or single piece of tech that's going to tell you you can absolutely trust this or you absolutely can't. I think you have to paint a vivid story where the synthetic control might be one of your key details, but it is supported by an army of other details that show that the marketplace was existing in a certain state, and then when this intervention happened, it truly moved it to a new equilibrium. I hope that answers your question, but when I hear you talk about it, it makes me reflect on my time as a scientist, especially coming from academia to data science, where one of the biggest trials by fire for me was learning that the name of the game isn't just find some cool estimator and estimate something and say the treatment was this, and then receive your trophy. It's doing a lot of dirty legwork to try to figure out, well, if you estimated this, why is that? And is it plausible that if you use a different estimator, you got a different impact? Or if you change the treatment stat date, say like depending on the granularity of data that you had, you got a different impact. And especially like as an economist, as an academic economist, what I was before in a previous life, your whole worldview was I got to write a paper. And this paper has to have this clear story, and you have pretty limited data. And then you move into industry, and you still have to tell a story because stories help us make sense of the world in front of us, and they help us separate the wheat from the chaff. But you have so much more data available to you, and you're in a far more complex system that you simply cannot ignore because of the amount of data that you have. The data isn't just some table that you query. It can be your friend over in like the marketing department or the writer department, and you Slack them and you say, hey, did something happen? Oh, yeah, actually, we did this huge thing and blah, blah, blah. And you think, oh, man, okay, yeah, I got to think about that. I think in a lot of ways, life teaches us that you have to combine sources of information. Think about the brain. The brain is like this data scientist in a windowless room, and it's taking in information, tactile, audio, visual, and it's combining all of it to make a mental model of reality, the thing that you experience from one day to the next. It doesn't just say the world is this because like I collected a couple photons and like there's a thing out there. It tries to integrate all this information in a way someone much smarter than we could probably explain. But similarly, I think as a data scientist, you can't just say, I ran an estimator, the causal effect is this. You have to find ways to combine different sources of information. You brought up observational and randomized data a minute ago. And I know there's been a ton of work. I think surrogate modeling did a lot with this, where it tries to find ways to estimate long-term impacts by exploiting past experiments. So a lot of econometrics, for instance, had exploited instrumental variables, where you're looking for like some kind of plausible exogenous source of variation that's moving one side of a system that allows you to credibly estimate the other side of the system. So like the classic example is prices are determined in equilibrium. So you need some kind of exogenous shock on the supply curve that changes prices and allows you to trace out the demand curve. Another really cool thing about firms, especially more mature ones like Lyft, where they've been successfully running experiments for a long time now, I mean, at least over a decade, is that they have tons of these exogenous shifters. They have all of these historical experiments. And I think some of the surrogate modeling papers did some interesting work where they said, well, what if you just use old experiments as instruments? Because they are plausible sources of exogenous variation. You randomized. It couldn't get more plausible than that. I mean, to a degree, but you never feel like your work is done. You leave a place and then you suddenly start thinking, oh, there's all this other cool stuff I could have done. And I think if I could have spent another lifetime at Lyft, it would have been finding really interesting ways to combine all of our observational and experimental data into mosaics that give you a richer view of the causal impact of something big that happened in a marketplace at a given time.
Lawrence, you mentioned estimating long-term impact. When we look at A/B tests in industry, especially in these digital environments or digitalized environments, we often run these experiments over relatively short periods of time. And we hope that they will generalize in the future, at least for some time. What have been your experience with generalization over longer periods of time? For instance, if we find an effect of something, of a particular promotion, a particular way of nudging the customer, the client, for how long do you feel this particular finding will be valid?
I don't have a rule of thumb, but the curse of a successful experiment is that you launch your intervention, and if it was really good, then you change the equilibrium. But then if you change the equilibrium, the other side of the marketplace might respond in a way that you didn't anticipate. I think there was a paper that came out of BU. My friend Andre Franken told me about it when he gave a talk at Lyft a couple months ago. This author, this economist, had studied effectively personalized pricing or targeted pricing in hotels, and found ways where hotels were finding ways to personalize prices to consumers. And in the short run, it estimated some like large impact, like revenue goes up, let's say, paraphrasing the details. But in the short term, it looks really good. And then what happens in the long term is that the demand side completely adjusts. And as a result, the short-term benefits essentially go away. We've seen this in the famous ride-sharing markets re-equilibrate paper. I think that first came out in 2017 or something. I think it finally got published in 2023. It's like the canonical, for me, it's like the canonical ride-sharing paper. Like if you're going to join a ride-sharing company, you got to read this paper before you start. It traces out the effect of a demand, of a price increase on the marketplace. And it basically shows that when there is a sustained price increase, both sides of the marketplace adjust at different times that eventually resettle at a new equilibrium that's just different from the original one. It's like the canonical story where as the price goes up, in a world in which driver pay is tied to the price, wages go up. So you get paid more per ride, which is great. And then as a result, because there's very relaxed market entry, more drivers heed the siren call and they enter the marketplace and they start driving more. So the supply goes up. At the same time, the demand is falling because prices are increased. And you get this over I think it was a 13-week period or so, this re-equilibration where eventually utilization, the amount of time that passengers actually spend in drivers' cars, goes down, hourly wages go down, and then drivers leave the marketplace because it's no longer beneficial to them. So things that can look good in the short run don't always look as good in the long run. Oh, and one other anecdote, I'm reminded of this paper. I don't know if you saw it, but I'm blanking on who wrote it, but it was about policy experimentation in China. And they had this incredible graph. They had charted policy experimentation in the country from the 1980s until today. They obtained this very rich data source. And they basically look at what was the intervention, which prefects or regions got the intervention, what was the outcome of the intervention, and then when it was rolled out to all regions in the country, what was the long-term impact. And so, in a way, the country was like the original tech firm. We're going to experiment on a little bit of our experimentation resources, then we're going to see what happens, and then if it looks good, we're going to roll it out. And there was this graph where they show the standardized effects of the in-sample experiment results, and then they show what happens when you roll it out long term. And like the in-sample is up here, looks really good, and then the long term is like right there. And what the paper discusses is that there were challenges with randomization. So like the reason why some places got the intervention in the first place can be connected to strategic incentives being misaligned. People are up for promo and they strategically decide, I'm going to randomize here because I'm essentially putting my thumb on the scale. It's going to make it look better than it actually is. And then also the simple fact that regions are very different. And so if it worked in one place, it may not work in another, right? And I understand your question as the ultimate challenge of, well, like if it grows in the garden, is it going to grow in the forest? And your experiment is the garden, and you're trying to figure out if it's going to grow everywhere else. I think in a lot of cases where something looked really good in the short term, and then you rolled it out and it didn't look as good in the long term, or not what you would have expected, I think it's a combination of there was heterogeneity that you just didn't really account for. It might have just worked at that time and place because that place is just straight up different, or that time was a great time to run that intervention for some reason that you have to go figure out, or because you change the equilibrium dynamics of the marketplace. And as a result, there was this temporary bump that kind of evened out in the long term. I think it kind of speaks to the general challenge of experimentation, which is that, like any estimate, your average treatment effect is just a picture of a moment in time and place. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to hold in another moment of time and in another place. I think some firms have done things like long-term holdouts or synthetic holdouts, where if you can't guarantee that you're always going to keep 10% of your population unexposed at all times, you find clever ways to take people who were not exposed to experiments at certain times and combine them to make it look like they were not exposed ever. And so compare them to people who were exposed to, like, say, many experiments over a period of time. It just said, like, I don't know if this is a very intelligent answer. And part because I don't know if I have one. I don't know how you guarantee that the long-term impact is going to be the same as the short-term impact. I think it comes down to this thing I said earlier, where you have to integrate all different kinds of sources of knowledge. The more you understand how your product or how your marketplace or how the world that you're interested in functions, the more you can get an understanding of what's going to work in the long and short run, or how much uncertainty you can put around something working in the long run.
I think guaranteeing that something will be in the long run the same as it's in the short term, I'm not sure if there's anyone in the world who would like to bet a significant amount of money on that. I don't know. Maybe it depends. In physics, it's probably easier than in any complex system like a marketplace. When I was talking to Dima Goldenberg from Booking.com, I asked him, because Booking runs a lot of experiments. They A/B test even bug fixes. So if they have a bug in their code base, they fix the bug. They do not release the fixed version into production before testing it. They A/B test the bug fix. So they have a very, very strong culture of experimentation. And so Dima have seen hundreds or maybe thousands of experiments and was involved in designing and carrying them out. And I was very curious what was his most surprising finding regarding human nature when he was observing the effects of these experiments. And I wanted to ask a slightly modified version of this question to you as well. What has been the most surprising fact about the market that you learned about working with experiments, synthetic experiments, and so on?
I'll try to answer the question in steps. Something that is a major challenge, I imagine Dima faced this as well, running so many experiments, is that a firm obviously wants to increase throughput. It wants to test things and it wants to get them out there for the benefit of the customers. That means that you're running tons and tons of experiments, and there's a good chance that a lot of experiments are stepping on each other. So the marketplace itself isn't just complicated and complex, rather. The experimentation on the marketplace is extremely complex. One thing that I don't know if I really learned, but something that really stuck with me is just how potentially impactful the amount of interactions between experiments can be. So an experiment can look really good, but maybe it looks really good because you're treated were also in some other experiment, or a lot of them were in some other experiment, and they were getting some other treatment that actually was even better than yours, and you're picking up a lot of that effect. Now, in some randomization, if it's done well, should attenuate a lot of that. But you also have this problem again where, because the experiment is done over time and you're collecting exposures or individuals, to say in an A/B test, from one day to the next, and experiments don't perfectly overlap. You launch your experiment in week 1, and then in like week 2, somebody else launches their experiment, and that experiment's like really great and is borrowing a lot of your exposures. Then the week 2 exposures are more likely to maybe have a positive impact as it appears in your experiment results because they're actually bringing in information from the other experiment. And now imagine that you don't just have 2 experiments, but you have like thousands of experiments that are happening concurrently. And so you can think about estimators that, like, say, use fixed effects to try to net this out, or directly testing for the interactions, but it can get pretty unwieldy. And so something that I guess just really stuck with me, I don't know if this is a surprise about our marketplace. I never saw something like the demand curve slopes upward, something crazy like that. But something that just really stuck with me was just how difficult it can be, even in your perfectly designed experiment, to know exactly what happened unless you get into the weeds and try to figure out who is exposed when and to what. And when you account for all of these overlapping exposures, how did your treatment actually look? As to the people who run a marketplace and experiments in it, I feel very forgiving because it's so damn hard to know what's going on and to know what you're measuring. I think there's a very deep human tendency to take good news at face value and to investigate bad news even further. And I think that when you get a great experiment result, there's so much pressure often to just get it out there that you say, okay, look, this looks great. We've got the treatment effect that we wanted, so we're going to push it. But then when you find something that you don't like, the treatment effect went in the wrong direction. Oh boy, what's going on? We got to go figure this out. You're doing all this due diligence that would have been great to also have applied to the positive result. Because what if the positive result was a fluke? What if there was an interaction, and so on? And I think what impressed me about Lyft was that there were so many people who took the time to say, okay, well, I found this cool result, but like, can I trust it? And I think it stuck with me because when you run an experiment, you're like this gambler in a way. And when the dealer turns the card and it's a good one for you, there's this button that goes off in your brain and says like, oh, hey, this is great. You keep doing it. And you don't necessarily think about it. You don't necessarily stop and investigate, okay, what's going on here? And similarly, when you see, green on your experiment scorecard, the treatment effect is going in the right direction. Because it can take months to get an experiment off the ground, to get the buy-in from people, to do all the preliminaries, to figure out everything that you need to figure out. Seeing a good result right off the bat can, I think, as a human, just make it really easy not to go deeper into it. And I was really impressed with people who, like Lyft had this great experiment culture. They had this great tech, but they also had this great character to say, well, I'm gonna figure out what's truly going on, whether it's good or whether it's bad, because our goal here is not to just find a bunch of positive treatment effects. Our goal really is to make the rideshare marketplace better. And so that's something that really stuck with me. It stuck with me because it was a trait that you had to develop as a scientist. It wasn't just some piece of tech, some piece of code that you had to run.
When it comes to interactions, I think Ronnie Kohavi likes to say that they do not happen very often, and he shares his test for interactions, right? That takes the average effect, that basically compares the means, the sum of the means with the potential interaction terms and so on. But we know that platforms can be different, right? One platform can be different from another. Would you say, from your experience, that interactions are rare?
Yeah, so I think there's this endogeneity problem, right? Because the interactions that you might see are going to be a function of what experiments you run, where you run them, and what the interventions are. So if you went to a marketplace, San Francisco, and you say, I'm going to change the dispatch algorithm, and then I'm also going to change the pricing algorithm, and I'm going to test all these other odds and ends, and they're all marketplace level tests. Well, you're changing the marketplace in tons of different ways. And as a result, you should expect to see quite a bit of interaction. You might end up with someone who gets a really bad draw of the dispatch experiment and a really bad draw of the pricing experiment, and suddenly the product doesn't look so great. Or you flip it on its head and they get really good draws of all the other experiments concurrently, and this product is awesome. Are they converting because of one or the other? It's really hard to say. And then let's say all of these are time split experiments. The problem with the time split is that you can still have this carryover effect or this carryover bias, because as you switch back between treatment and control from 1 hour to the next, the marketplace, or whatever the time bucket is, it could be an hour, it could be longer, it does depend on your carryover effect, because as the marketplace is kind of adjusting from seeing one version of the experiment to the next, there could be individuals carrying over, hence the carryover effect, their experience of the treatment into the control period, and in which case you have this bias problem. And so for any one experiment, you can try to tune that and account for that by saying, if I expect large carryover effects, then I should randomize over course units of time, randomize over 2 hours instead of 1 hour, so that when I switch between, there's very little contamination between treatment and control. I think there's no guarantee that you will have zero interaction if you want to run a lot of experiments at the same time, which most places do, understandably. But it just depends a lot on what it is you're testing and where you're testing.
In your work, you work a lot with abstract ideas and mathematics. But as a child, you did not like math at all.
No, wow.
Where was your journey from that place to here?
Calling me out here. Yeah, journey is a good word for it. Yeah, I didn't like math. I didn't get it. I didn't see it. But I really like sports. I really like music. I really like writing. I really like storytelling. I was one of my favorite singers when I was a kid was Paul Simon. And just the other night, I was listening to a podcast he gave, and he said this really cool line. He said, "The listener completes the song." And I love that line, because you write something, but it only really comes alive when someone else hears it or someone else reads it. In a lot of ways, I find that the listener completes the song is also true about models that you write, like a mathematical model. You're trying to say something about the world, about something that interests you, and it comes alive when someone else reads it and discovers it and starts to play with it themselves. And I guess that's what's happened to me. I didn't, I thought I was just going to be like a soccer player or something. And then after soccer player, I thought I'd be a journalist. And I think it was in my second year of college, for my major, I had to take an econ class. And I thought, econ is boring. I don't want to do this. And micro was very boring. I don't remember much about that class. But then I had to take a second class. It was an elective, and there was this class called environmental economics. And I thought, that sounds pretty interesting. I had this professor, Laurel Adams. She was awesome. And she taught us about carbon emissions trading, which at the time was this really hot topic. And it was this idea that you could make a marketplace to price a bad. So you price a good like jet fuel and an airplane ticket on an airplane that uses the jet fuel that takes you from, San Francisco to Boston. But that combustion produces pollution, and who's going to pay for that? Or more generally, what's the price of that? And so first, like at that age, I just never even thought about that, as naive as that sounds. And then going through the course, it was a revelation that you could build a marketplace around it. Depending on how you built the marketplace, how you designed it, you were either going to get the true social cost of carbon emissions, or you weren't. And I think what brought me back into math was this sense of creation. You could create a marketplace out of thin air. It wasn't just like something that was as given. Like as a kid, there's the grocery store and there's the corner store, and you kind of just think these always existed, for time eternal. And this is how the world has always been. And then as you get older, you realize that everything is constructed and created to some degree. And the idea that you could create a marketplace and you could say things about that marketplace that does not yet exist using some stylized facts, historical data, and above all, a mathematical model was really cool to me. It wasn't just like solving algebra exercises. It was trying to tell a story using these different symbols. That's what really motivated me to go back and really try to learn math. This tool of creation. It was like a guitar or like an instrument. You could create stuff with it. And I guess because of who I am, that just really appealed to me. I wasn't necessarily like amazing at it though, I gotta say, but like
What were two books that changed your life?
Two books that changed my life. Wind, Sand, and Stars by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. He's the guy who wrote The Little Prince.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody knows that book, but he wrote this other book about his work as an independent pilot all around the world. And it was this to me this great book about being passionate about something and following it wherever it's going to lead. And it doesn't always lead you to good places. It's not like I'm passionate about something and then I worked hard and I was a success. Like a lot of times you're actually not a success, or on paper you're not. But the book speaks about the deep emotional riches that come from really pursuing a craft. And he was also a beautiful writer, and it spoke to me a lot. And then another book was An Anthropologist on Mars by Oliver Sacks. I think Oliver Sacks actually, if I had to credit one writer who really I look to think about what a scientist should be, it's Oliver Sacks. He brought back this old style of medical writing that I think had been prevalent in the 19th century. You see a patient in your office, but then you follow them at home. You see them in their day-to-day life. You learn what it is to live in the world as they do. And he, besides having this beautiful style of writing, he wrote so eloquently about people who, in this particular book, were by all accounts normal. They could see, and then something happens, and then suddenly they can't see. And what it's like to go from one equilibrium to the next, that painful, long journey that sometimes ends well and sometimes doesn't. I think it really stuck with me because it, to me, said the human experience is very fragile and it's very context dependent. And there's so much that we take for granted. I take for granted all the time that like I have touch and that I smell things and that I have color vision. And then I think back to the case of the colorblind painter. I think it's the first chapter in that book where he gets in a car accident and then he wakes up and he can no longer see color. Imagine being a painter who can see color. The chapter takes you on that journey. And it's, again, a great example of combining different pieces of information as he observes this person in their day-to-day life and listens to their accounts of their condition. And it tells you that the story is in all the details put together. It's not one detail over the next. And like we were saying about, estimating causal effects, it's not just you run the synthetic control, you get an estimate, and then that's the end of the story. It's actually just part of a tapestry that you're weaving. And so I think I read that book like once a year.
Oh, wow. That's beautiful. I love Oliver Sacks. I must tell you, when I was younger, I think I read all his books,
And I think another, like, maybe not one book. I'll add one more. I know you didn't ask me to, but another one is it's not one particular book, but I've started reading a lot about the age of sail, and for some reason, it has really struck a chord with me about what it's like to work in industry. So, for instance, I was reading about Magellan, and Magellan actually defected from Portugal to Spain because he wasn't getting the support he wanted, and he brought with him two cosmographers. He basically brought two data scientists, and he goes to Spain, and he says, we have this great idea about how we're going to find a connection to the Pacific Ocean, and we're going to prove that Portugal is actually harvesting spices on Spanish territory. Because in the Treaty of Tordesillas, the Pope had divided the world in half, but he only divided the front of the world. Nobody knew what was the division on the backside. And their proof was that they were going to show the longitude of the Spice Islands to show that at the meridian that they were at in the Pacific was actually on Spanish territory. And at the time, this is early 16th century, there was still really no great way to find longitude. And this is like 200 years before John Harrison's marine chronometer. And these two data scientists essentially said, well, we have this great technique. It's called magnetic declination. So they had noticed over time that the compass of a needle doesn't always point to true north. It sways a little bit, and that sway is correlated with east-west distance. And so the idea is that like you could get on a latitude and you could run a westing. So you just run straight along that latitude. And if you know the declination of your compass, the degree to which it sways, at a reference point like Seville, where they left, it's about 0 degrees declination, and you take regular intervals, then you can more or less back out what your longitude is. And so they go to the court of Spain and they say, look, this is going to work great. We have this new tech. It's awesome. You should fund our expedition. No problem. And what they, of course, didn't have was a map of the geomagnetic field, which when you look at it, it doesn't line up nicely with a modern map of longitude. These lines go in all crazy directions. And so the idea was that they basically thought, magnetic declination is going to be this linear function of east-west distance. And it's actually the super highly nonlinear function that you just cannot, you could not approximate in that time.
It's
but still,
the assumptions in absence of understanding the true underlying data generating process. Something
exactly.
we deal with every day.
Exactly. But here's the thing is that, okay, the way I've told the story so far, you think this mission is going to be a total failure. They're going to get out in the high seas and magnetic declination is going to quickly reveal itself to be untrustworthy. They're going to have no idea where they are. In some ways, actually, as we all know, it was a success. They found the strait between South America and Antarctica. They got through. And in that way, it was a success. In a lot of other ways, it was a failure. They sent out 5 ships. Only one came back, and it was in tatters. Magellan didn't even make it back. Something just resonated with me about the story of, we have this tech. It's totally going to work. And actually, in retrospect, the tech was flawed from the start, but they went and did it anyway. And I guess the tech really was just an excuse to make the strategic risk that I guess the court of Spain had to make at that time. So
I love that.
In some ways, it's a lesson that the tools at the moment in time are never perfect. And sometimes you just have to take a risk and hope for the best.
That's a beautiful ending. Before we close, I want to ask you one more question. What's your message to the causal community?
Don't send all your ships out there on magnetic declination. Try to get a better piece of tech. But on a more serious note, I guess keep finding inspiration from other places. I think clues are always out there. One literature, if like all I read was economics papers, I learned a lot about economics, but maybe I wouldn't appreciate all that there is about what causal can do and how marketplaces work and how we can best study them and intervene and make them better. There's a lot of knowledge out there. There's a lot of people who know things, especially like within a firm. There's a lot of people who really know the product, even if their background for whatever reason is not in causal inference. Maybe they're not as technical, but they're very, very smart and they have lots of great ideas. And they're always people that you should talk to. I'm rambling here because I'm trying to figure out what to say, but I think my answer is like, go out and talk to people that you wouldn't necessarily talk to, because they probably have something really insightful for you to say.
Great. Thank you so much, Lawrence. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, I appreciate it.